When Robert Ballard's team finally found the Bismarck in June of 1989, they expected wreckage. What they found instead terrified people who understood what it meant. Not because the ship was destroyed, because it wasn't. I don't need to tell you how the Bismarck sank. If you're watching this, you probably already know the story. The pride of the German Navy sinks HMS Hood in under 3 minutes. Churchill orders every available British ship into the Atlantic to hunt her down. A lucky torpedo hit jams her rudder, and 2 British battleships close in for the kill. What I want to talk about is what happened after she went under. Because 48 years later, when a research vessel finally located her 3 miles down on the floor of the Atlantic, the wreck itself told a story that nobody on either side had been telling. And the man who found it made a decision that day that still shapes everything we know about that ship. Robert Ballard was already famous by 1989. 4 years earlier, he had found the Titanic. Finding the Bismarck was, in some ways, the harder problem. The wreck was smaller, the search area larger, and nobody knew exactly where the ship had gone down. Ballard's team spent weeks combing roughly 200 square miles of open ocean with sonar before they finally got a hit on the 8th of June, 1989. The wreck lay around 470 miles west of Brest, France, at a depth of nearly 15,700 feet, just shy of 3 miles down. What the cameras showed when they reached the hull was not what anyone expected. The Bismarck was sitting upright on the seabed, her keel buried in the mud, roughly up to her original waterline. Despite everything the Royal Navy had thrown at her, despite hundreds of shell hits and multiple torpedo strikes, the hull was largely intact. In places, the original teak decking was still visible. Paint was still on the metal. This was one of the best preserved deep water wrecks anyone had ever documented, and that alone should have made headlines. But it was what Ballard didn't find that mattered most. Here's the part that takes a second to understand, and once you do, it changes the whole story. When a ship sinks with air still trapped inside its compartments, the water pressure at extreme depth crushes those spaces inward as the ship descends. You get implosion damage, twisted metal, buckled bulkheads, structural failure from the inside out. It's violent, and it's very recognisable to anyone who knows what to look for. Ballard's team looked for exactly that kind of damage on the Bismarck, and they didn't find it. Ballard himself put it simply: the hull did not implode. That single observation is quietly one of the most important pieces of evidence anyone has ever gathered about the Bismarck's final hour. If the ship had still been sealed and full of trapped air when she went down, 3 miles of water pressure would have crushed her on the way to the bottom. She wasn't crushed, which means she was already flooded, extensively, before she ever left the surface. The compartments were open to the sea, and that lines up with what German survivors always said, that in her final minutes, the order was given to scuttle her, to open the sea cocks and let the ocean in on her own cruise terms, rather than the Royal Navy's. Most naval historians now agree the battle damage alone would eventually have sunk her regardless. But the wreck itself, sitting there on the ocean floor with no implosion scarring, backs up the idea that she was already dying from the inside before the final shells even landed. Ballard's team also found something else on that first survey, something that quietly raises more questions than it answers. Along the hull, they documented 8 holes, 1 on the starboard side, 7 on the port, all of them above the waterline. Shell damage, not torpedo damage, at least as far as that first expedition could determine. 1 shell had apparently struck the starboard anchor chain and simply vanished down through the deck, chain and all. But here's the thing. Ballard's remotely operated vehicles in 1989 were not built to penetrate the interior of a warship. They surveyed the exterior, thoroughly and carefully, and then they left. Whatever else was inside that hull stayed sealed, undocumented, for over a decade. And then there's the decision Ballard made once the survey was finished. He kept the exact coordinates of the wreck secret. Deliberately. This was not an oversight. Ballard had seen what happened to other famous wrecks once their locations became public. He considered the recovery of objects from a war grave a form of grave robbing, and the Bismarck, with somewhere around 2,000 men still entombed inside her, was exactly that, a war grave. So he sat on the coordinates, and for over a decade, nobody went back. That silence ended in the summer of 2001. 2 separate expeditions reached the wreck within weeks of each other, and together they finally started to answer the questions Ballard's exterior survey had left open. The first arrived in June, organised by a company called Deep Ocean Expeditions and led by an Australian named Michael McDowell. They used the Russian research vessel Academic Keldysh, the same ship that had carried tourists down to the Titanic, along with its two-manned Mir submersibles, each capable of carrying a pilot and 2 observers down to depths of 6,000 metres. What made this expedition different wasn't the technology, it was who was on board. 2 actual Bismarck survivors, Heinrich Kuhnt and Heinz Stieg, made the journey out to the site where their shipmates had died 6 decades earlier, accompanied by the chairman of the German Veterans Association for the ship. Men who had been pulled from the freezing Atlantic in 1941, sitting on the deck of a research ship, looking down at coordinates that had been kept secret, specifically to protect the resting place of the men they'd served beside. Barely a month later, a second expedition arrived, this one led by David Mearns of Blue Water Recoveries, on their way to search for the wreck of HMS Hood. They stopped at the Bismarck site with a remotely operated vehicle called Magellan, mounted with side-scan sonar and high-powered lights, and they laid a plaque on the wreckage, an Ehrentafel, a roll of honour, carrying the names of every man who died aboard her. But Mearns didn't just come to pay respects. He came to examine the hull, and what his team found reopened the entire argument about how the Bismarck actually died. Mearns concluded that British gunfire alone had almost certainly not been enough to sink her. He pointed to torpedo damage, to flooding from shell hits, to the ship's own crew counter-flooding compartments to fight fires, and to the final torpedo strikes from the pursuing British cruisers. In his account, the Bismarck was already wallowing, already dying, when the scuttling charges went off. He didn't dismiss the German scuttling account entirely. He believed it, but he believed it only hastened something that was already happening. Then, less than a year later, James Cameron went further than anyone had before. In May and June of 2002, using smaller and more manoeuvrable Mir submersibles than Ballard had access to in 1989, Cameron's team became the first to actually get inside parts of the wreck's hull structure and examine the sides in detail. What they found was something Ballard's survey couldn't have caught: a massive hydraulic outburst where the sheer force of the ship hitting the seabed bow first had blown apart the shell plating along the join between the hull and the armour belt. And the stern, the entire stern section of the ship, had broken away completely. It wasn't found anywhere near the main wreckage. It still hasn't been located to this day. The evidence suggests it detached not on impact with the ocean floor, but earlier, at the surface, in the ship's final minutes, right around where the original torpedo had struck. The Bismarck's sister ship, the Prinz Eugen, suffered an almost identical stern failure after a torpedo hit the following year, which is exactly why the Germans went back afterward and reinforced the stern structure on every capital ship they had left. So here is where all 3 of these threads actually meet. Ballard finds a hull with no implosion damage and quietly keeps the location secret to protect it. A decade later, 2 survivors go back and watch strangers examine the resting place of their entire crew. And Cameron's cameras finally show a stern that simply isn't there anymore, sheared off, drifting somewhere in the dark that no one has ever found. 3 expeditions, 13 years apart, and together they tell a story neither the German nor the British accounts alone ever fully captured. Not a clean single answer of who sank the Bismarck, but a ship that was already coming apart from multiple directions at once, hit by torpedoes, flooded by her own crew, scuttled in her final minutes, and then torn open by the sheer violence of hitting the seabed 3 miles down. Germany still legally owns that wreck. Their government has been explicit. Any expedition into the interior, any recovery of anything at all, requires their permission, and it is almost never given, because there are still men down there. The Bismarck sits exactly where Ballard found her, upright, mostly intact, her missing stern still out there somewhere in the mud, still keeping its own secret. Nobody is entirely sure how much of that ship's true final chapter has actually been recovered, and given how deep she sits, and how carefully her resting place has been protected, it's entirely possible nobody ever will. Now, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, let me know in the comments, and I'll keep making more of these. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you next time.